Hello, everyone. Welcome back to a very special episode today, number 200 for the Bryan Air Podcast, which is quite an achievement, I think, Paul.
Yeah, I can't believe we've actually made it to this milestone. It's happened pretty quickly.
It has. Yeah, this year we've kicked on, but an extra special episode because, as you can see in the studio, a person I shared episode 1 with back in September of 2019, which seems quite ridiculous now, thinking back. And my old man was on that show, Keith Roseveare, and Keith joins us in the studio today for number 200. How are you, Dad?
Yeah, hi guys, and what a privilege to be here on your 200th episode, and it's really fantastic. And yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, of course, it was a no-brainer. We wanted to get you on. We've been wanting to have you on the show for a while, and particularly because, obviously, like I said, we shared episode number 1, but whenever we chat about aviation, a lot of the time when I'm talking to you, the conversation inevitably goes back to flying in the old days. And not just you, a lot of these pilots, say old school pilots that we meet here at the Sim Center, the same thing. The conversation always inevitably goes back to the early days and places like Virginia Airport pop up and the guys that were in the Air Force, same thing. So I want to know what was so special about those old days. And maybe we can start today by just taking us back to some of your early memories into flying and how the hell you got into aviation. For me, it was a no-brainer to get in, but for you, a little bit different. So maybe you can take us back.
Mine goes right back to when I was a baby. My dad was a air radio operator at the old Stamford Hill Aerodrome. And I doubt whether many people listening would know what an air radio operator did, but quite amazingly, the old aircraft had no form of direction finding equipment in them at all. NDBs were non-existent, ADFs were non-existent, certainly no VORs. And a lot of the communication between the aircraft and any ground communication was done by Morse code. So the aircraft carried a radio operator, and he used to communicate with the air radio on the ground, passing various messages. There wasn't much in the form of air traffic control. There weren't enough aircraft in the air to worry about that. But air radio's main function was for position finding on the aircraft. Believe it or not, they all worked on HF radio. So if an aircraft was uncertain of his position, what he used to do was call one of the air radio operators, and there was one in Johannesburg, one in Durban, one in Bloemfontein, one in Cape Town, I think one in PE, and ask for a position. What he then used to do was hold his Morse key down to transmit a continuous signal. The air radio operators, that my dad was one, had a little hut that they used to sit in away from any other interference, and a little loop antenna on the roof. And they used to turn this loop antenna till they got the null. That showed the position on a big map. They then used to draw the line on the map, basically the QDM. So did Bloemfontein, so did Johannesburg. It formed a little cocked hat, okay, and plumb in the middle of that was where the aircraft was. And it was very, very accurate. And they would then go back to the aircraft and say, at time 0506 Zulu, you were positioned south so-and-so, east so-and-so, and the aircraft would then reposition himself on the map. They had a navigator as well. And till they got lost again, and then they would ask again. And that's what air radio used to do. My dad was in air radio during the Second World War, and funny enough, based at Rand Airport. he escaped the action, but he just carried on with air radio after the Second World War. Air radio then got phased out and replaced by VHF radios, air traffic control, and ADFs came on the scene and made life a hell of a lot easier for the pilots. Stamford Hill Aerodrome, I think I went there. I've got a picture of myself and my dad there when I was still in nappies. Probably I was about 14 years old, but nevertheless, I was still in nappies. And obviously I saw all the old aircraft, the airspeed consoles and Oxfords and Junkers, Ju-52s and the Harvards, and all these aircraft came in there. They then moved across to Louis Botha Airport, and I obviously went to work as often as I could with my dad. And I was there to witness the crash of the Vampire, a single-seater Vamp, on the practicing for the opening day of Louis Botha Airport. There were two Vamps doing high-speed fly-past, one a twin-seater Vamp, one a single-seater Vamp. I think the pilot of the twin-seater Vamp was Kappie Brodrake, which ended up in South African Airways. I'm not 100% sure. Obviously, I was a little light. He was about 6. The single-seater Vamp came screaming past, lost control. I think he got Dutch roll, knowing now, but I didn't know then, and went straight into the ground where the apron is at Louis Botha Airport, and one big fireball and flame, and that was that. It was my introduction to how dangerous aviation could be. So obviously my aviation knowledge and interest goes way back. When it was time to go and do my national service after school, I applied for the Air Force, managed to get into the Air Force gym, and later applied during that year for air traffic control. Got sent to Petersburg to do a air traffic control course, met some absolutely fantastic guys there. Some of them ended up in South African Airways too. Picky Langeveld was one of them. I know Picky and his brother. Picky ended up buying my Piper Cub eventually. Quite a funny story. He phoned me and said, "Keith, I believe you got a Cub, ZSAYC." So I said, "Yeah." So he said, "I want to buy it." So I said, "I don't really want to sell it." He said, "No, I've got to buy it." I said, "Why?" So he said, "Well, his wife and him had their first kiss in that aircraft, and he wanted to buy it," which he did. And I think they still own it. Excuse me. So anyway, after the Air Force, I joined civilian air traffic control based at Louis Botha Airport, and once again worked with an absolute wonderful bunch of people there. A well-known gentleman by the name of Jimmy Lang was our boss. He was what they called the control air traffic controller. He was a really lovely guy. And then we had Tubby Ronald, Peter Morgan. Peter was an interesting guy. He was a bomber commander, Lancaster bomber commander during the Second World War. And he had some really funny stories to tell. A quiet guy, but once he and I were on duty together, I'd be really interested in all the stories he could tell. Particularly one that comes to mind was, he said after the war, they were flying in and out of Berlin, and he was allocated a Blackburn Beverly to fly, which has got to be one of the ugliest aircraft ever built. And he was very proud of it. It was modern compared to the wartime stuff. And when he landed in Berlin, the air traffic controller said to him, the American air traffic controller said to him, "What type of aircraft's that?" So he said, "Oh, this is a Blackburn Beverly." So the controller said, "Did you make it yourself?" And he had all these funny stories that came out today. Absolutely wonderful character. There was Mike Melrose. He was very instrumental in teaching me how to be an air traffic controller in those days. Roy Blount was the second in charge, also fantastic person to work with. And then the younger guys, Rob Perkis. Rob's still around. I speak to him regularly. John Whitaker. John ended up at SAA, and then after that went to Korean. He retired a couple of years ago. And John was the one that came to me with a little scrappy piece of paper and said, "Hey, Keith, why don't we learn to fly?" So I said, "Well, how much does it cost?" So he said, "Well, I got all the prices here." He said, you can learn to fly with the Durban Wings Club, little Cessna 150. It's 8 Rand an hour solo, 10 Rand an hour dual. So, that's quite a lot of money. I think I was earning 110 Rand a month on my salary at time. And that was before tax. And then he said you could also go to Twin Air, which was a lovely guy, ex-Typhoon pilot from the Second World War by the name of Ted Cunnison. Him and his wife ran that little business. He had Cherokee 140s and a Cherokee 180, and he was about 12 Rand an hour, I think, and 14 dual or something. Or you could go to Virginia Flying School, which had been bought by Vern McWilliams from National Airways. And Vern, who it's quite fitting that we're having this conversation today, Vern was one of the big characters at Virginia Airport, and very sadly he passed away 2 weeks ago at the ripe age of 93. And Vern never looked after himself. He was always in good shape. I don't think he ever exercised other than his arm, drinking rather large quantities of alcohol. He was a party goer of note and the naughtiest guy you could ever meet in your life, but an absolutely lovely character. And Vern had this little flying school. It was part of National Airways Natal, which I'll get on to further, how National Airways Natal came about. And Vern offered me a discount on my flying by 1 Rand an hour. So I learned to fly at his flying school for, I think, 10 Rand an hour with on a little Beechcraft Musketeer. He had 3 of them, ZS IMW, ZS NAC, and ZS NBC. NBC was an aerobat that got lost in the aerobatic area. I don't know what happened. It was flown by a guy by the name of Peter Christensen, and he lost his life in that. So that's how I learned to fly. I did my PPL there with a guy by the name of Dennis Bishop. Dennis was unbelievable. He was an aerobatic champion, South African aerobatic champion. He flew a little Citabria. ZSFKL, his registration was. He snapped a elevator cable doing a flick roll. I think you call it a flick roll, where you stall the aircraft in the horizontal over the Hot Rod Stadium. The battery had leaked out acid and eaten through the elevator cable.
Shit.
And he managed to recover using the little trim lever and then the throttle, and he managed to fly it back to Virginia. He was an absolutely amazing guy. Dennis, unfortunately, was murdered. He had a robbery at his house much later in life, and he actually shot one of the intruders, and then at a later stage, the others came after him, and very sadly, Dennis lost his life. So he was very instrumental in my flying, and he had this absolute incredible way of saying, "Keith, you never ever land or take off anywhere else other than on the center line." And even as a 2-hour pilot, I had to keep that aircraft straight on the center line. And ever since then, it's been my thing. When I train here, I drive the guys mad, making them stay on the bloody center line on takeoff and landing. It all goes back to Dennis. But anyway, a little bit on National Airways. National Airways was a big company in Johannesburg, was owned by Lonro, I think, at the time, run by the Conlins, or Graham Conlin, Brian Frankel, and Nigel Forrester were the main guys there. And Vern managed to register a company by the same name in Natal. And National Airways Johannesburg, they were the Beechcraft agents, or a distributor or agent, I don't know what they were referred to as. And they used to sell a hell of a lot of aircraft. Sol Vern, he was down in Natal, and he was selling and also a huge amount of aircraft. And in those days, the whole population was very, very, very opulent. There was a lot of money around. And down in Durban, the people with a reasonable amount of money all owned aircraft. They, some of them, most of them Bonanzas, that type of aircraft at the time. Guys, there was Errol Edley, there was Peter Erickson, Brian and James Clark, Derek Savage, who owned T-Sav, the clothing, and he also owned the Sani Pass Hotel. There was Barry Fisher. He was married to Mike Rattray's sister, Gail. Brian, you've met Gail. She owned Exeter that we used to go to. And all these guys owned aircraft. And I'd get to work at Virginia Airport when I was allocated that shift in the tower. And on a Saturday morning, there were all these aircraft lined up in front of the terminal building. They were all off to Lorenzo Marx for a fly-in. And off they'd go. And then one of the guys, Vern would convince to buy a Baron. Okay. And obviously Vern would ferry the Baron out from the States. And once one of them had the Baron, they all had to have Barons. Okay. So Vern, by selling one Baron, sold about 12 Barons, and this is how it was. They used to, in the States, they used to buy themselves these big American cars. And if you kept them in the States for 6 months, you could bring them in South Africa duty-free. So they all drove Thunderbirds and big bloody Pontiac Firebirds and all the rest of it. It was just unbelievable. And these guys, together with the Durban Wings Club that had this little pub, they had the most raucous parties you've ever seen and come across in your life. If you go to the Durban Wings Club pub now, you'll see a big mural on the wall that was painted by a guy by the name of Arthur Morris. And in the one corner, you'll see a little piano with wings on it. Okay, and the story goes that all the guys were in the pub drinking one Friday night, and next this little guy arrived, sat at the piano and started playing the piano. So these guys said, what the hell's going on here? Music's a bit bloody miserable, So they went to this guy and said, look, do you mind shutting up? We're having fun. So he said, no, I've been allocated to time until 11 o'clock to play, So I didn't see this myself, but this is how the story goes. They said to him, have you ever been flying? So he said, no. So he said, would you like to fly? He said, yes. They threw the piano right through the plate glass window, which was on the first floor, into the swimming pool, which was down the bottom, hotly pursued by the pianist. And that's how the piano ended up on the mural in the wall at the Durban Wings Club. You've seen it, Brian. Yeah. I've had you there. And absolute wonderful times. Another guy joined the scene there by the name of Jim Redman. Jim was the world motorcycle champion in two classes. I think 250 and 350. They were two strokes in those days. And Jim bought a ranch called Sierra Ranch up near Moy River, and that became the new place to go and have a party. So everybody jumped in the aeroplanes and flew to Sierra Ranch, and some really raucous things, which I can't mention, happened at that place, I can assure you. The Wings Club itself had a little flying school. Chief flying instructor was Peter White, known as Chalky White. His wife was Anne. I was shit scared of Anne because I drew a funny little picture of Peter White one day and she got hold of it and nearly murdered me. Peter decided he was going to learn to fly a twin, so he got into a Aero Commander 500. And something happened on takeoff, so he aborted the takeoff, but he went right into the fence at the other side. So I drew a picture of everybody at Virginia Airport and Peter White in the fence, and that's when his wife nearly murdered me. And there was Peter Mellenby. He was one of the instructors, great guy. I believe he was killed on honeymoon in a car crash, very sadly. Brian Jackson was one of the instructors, the late Johan Lochner, he went to Rembrandt and he passed away relatively early in life. Russell Killian, I think his name was, also one of the instructors there. Great little school. I ended up, Vern McWilliams ended up owning he got the contract to run the school. After a while, the club, being a typical club, a committee trying to run it, they never got it right. They're a bunch of idiots. Vern McWilliams got the contract to run the club, the flying school part of the club. The committee were trying to run it. They didn't make a good job of it, so Vern took it over on a contract basis. And after a couple of years, he got tired of it. So myself and Mike Besson bought the club from him. I think he actually paid us to take it. It wasn't the club we bought, it was just a little flying school. We called it the Durban Wings Flight Center. And we took over the little Cessna 150s that they had. And later we switched across to Piper Tomahawks. And the first aircraft that I ever bought was a little Tomahawk, a ZS KKO. Mike Besson and I came up to Vorneboom. We picked it up. We paid 25,000 Rand for it. And we flew it down to Durban. They were wonderful little trainers. They had more space in them, more room in them than the Cessna 150s. And in 1982, 1983, the year you were born, Brian, we were running the club. I was CFI. Mike Besson was the financial director, counting a couple of pennies. Flying had become really expensive by then. It was 54 Rand an hour solo. So 500% more than what it was back in 72, 73. Anyway, we had that. That was fun. Taught a lot of very nice guys to fly. A lot of them, one that comes to mind, Noel Varty, absolutely lovely guy. He ended up at SA. He retired recently. Can't think who the other guys were that ended up at SAA. Another name worth mentioning was Brian Bretherton. Brian was a good couple of years younger than me when I was a young air traffic controller sitting upstairs in the tower there. Brian used to sell tickets for Comair for flips over the city. And Brian came up to the tower. He was about 14, I think, and he said to me, "No, I'm going to be a pilot, and when I leave school, I'm going to go to the Air Force and get my wings, and then I'm going to join SAA, and I'm going to be a captain." And that's exactly what he did. So he had the ambition way back. Brian and I are still friends. We communicate every now and again. He lives down in Durban. What else can I tell you after that? After the flying school, I started Executive Aerospace. I bought a company called Air Carriers. Now, Air Carriers was owned by Peter Savage, Bob Matthews, and Sid Rowe. Peter Savage had the commercial pilot's license number 1. He was the first commercial pilot in South Africa. They had this little company. They were getting old, and I was trying to get a charter license, which was darn near impossible in those days. So I ended up buying the company from them. And that we renamed Executive Aerospace, and we operated that for 23 years. And we produced, during that time, 69 pilots that from our cadet scheme that we took on with close to 200 hours, put them through our cadet scheme, and then released them 2 years later. And 69 of them ended up flying in the airlines, including Singapore Airlines, Cathay Pacific, SAA, you name it, all over the world. There's some in Australia now. They're all over. Most of them are in contact with me. They keep me updated and what they're doing. And it was an absolute passion of mine to try and help these guys that were in the situation I was in the early 70s, because what happened, I got my PPL, and John Whitaker and I decided we now got to do our comms. So John went off on a course with Aeronav Academy. They came down to Durban, and I said, no, man, I can't do a course. I'll fall asleep. So I studied at home, and at the end of the day, I got all 6 subjects first shot. But then the penny dropped. I had to get 200 hours within a year, because that's how it worked in those days.
Yes.
And there was no way I could afford it, no matter what I did, So I met an absolutely wonderful person by the name of Alf Hendy. He saw me studying in the control tower. He came up to file a flight plan. He owned a Bonanza ZS Aviation. And he said, what are you doing? So I said, I'm studying for my comms. So he said, oh, that's really nice, And he sort of, when he left, he said, oh, if anything I can do to help, you must shout. So after I got my subjects, I thought, man, I'm going to call Alf. So I called him. And I said, remember I was studying for my comms? So he said, yeah. So I said, well, I got all the subjects, and now I do need some help, but I have a solution. So my dad always said, don't ever ask anybody for help if you haven't got your own solution, So he said, right, what's the solution? So I said, well, I'll pay to do a rate, get the Bonanza on my license. Instead of you flying yourself around the country by yourself, I'll fly with you. We can take an IF hood with, and you can fly under the hood on the one sector, and I'll fly under the hood on the next sector. And you had to be 100 hours to be have 100 hours to be a safety pilot in those days. I didn't. He had, but that didn't seem to matter in those days. Flying was very free and easy. And that's what I did. And I took long leave from air traffic control. Alf was very kind. He arranged a hell of a lot of flights. All of a sudden, he got very busy. And I ended up getting my 200 hours and got my comm that way. And it was really good. Later, after I had a really shitty job that Vern McWilliams got for me, is one thing I can't thank Vern for. My very first job he got with the company he got me was a company called Twin Springs. Was owned by a guy by the name of Lindsay Tulloch, who was kind of a self-made mafia. And he had this Bonanza, and he and I came to blows when he wanted me to carry 7 passengers in an F-33 Bonanza one day. And I told him to stick his job where the sun don't shine. And that's how I left. Then I started flying for Alf at SA Signal, and flying the Bonanza, and later he bought a Baron, Juliet Kilo Zulu, JKZ, which he bought from Vern McWilliams. Was a fantastic little B-55 Baron, really lovely aircraft. Then in 1980, I convinced him to buy a King Air E90, which was on the market, ZS AMR. It was an E90, not the C90, the -28 engines, not the -21s. And it was much quicker. It was a really nice little aeroplane. Big aeroplane to me then. And when I started Executive Aerospace, that was my prime aircraft. I took a lease on that from SA Signal and operated that aircraft. So it was my first turbine. It was the first turbine in Durban. We were able to pick up the Shell contract. They required turbine aircraft. They came and audited us, had to be 2 crew, had to have an ALTP as a captain. And so we got the contract, and we did a lot of nice flying with that. Richards Bay Coal Terminal, Mike Dunn was the MD there, and Richards Bay Minerals was Roy McPherson, I think his name was. So we had a little niche market with the turbines. Errol Edley then bought a King Air 90, Killer Mike Alpha, and he was opposition to me. NAC then had been bought by NAC Joburg. Vern had sold it, and Vern went and bought himself an old DC-4, which made history when he used to carry horses around and fly the race horses around. And then one day he got a charter to go somewhere up to the Comores. I can't remember where it was. And him and Vic Miles flew this aircraft and put seats in it. And they went along, and this aircraft stunk of horse piss. And every time they hit a bit of turbulence, a horse piss came through the floor. And they had miscalculated their fuel, and they had to divert somewhere. And it was big shit that happened after that. Anyway, I don't know whatever happened to the horse box, which it was known as, but that was one of Vern's claims to fame. Anyway, Executive Aerospace developed. We ended up buying 5 Hawker Siddeley 748s. 3 of them were ex-Lufthansa DLT City Line aircraft, being operated by British Airways. They were pretty nice. They were 2Bs, the later version. The reason why we chose them, the market had opened up. The tourist market had opened up with the new government on its way, and things were opening up nicely for us. Tourists were starting to come in. And the 748, being a 44-seat, was the same size as a tour bus. And so we were doing a lot of flying for tour operators. And the nice part about it is you could take 44 people out of Mola Mola when Mola Mola was still quite a short little runway, at 40 degrees Celsius. It was absolutely amazing. You just switched the water meth on, the thing went like a rocket. When you switched the water meth off, it flew like a brick. But nevertheless, you were at least airborne by then. And we operated those for ages. And eventually we started operating the DC-9s, which we had hired from Global. Thanks to Jonathan Rosenzweig for putting up with us and letting us use your aircraft. But we operated them for many, many years. And that's when Bryan joined us. And Bryan and I did many, many charters together, father and son in the cockpit. We chose all the nice charters. Wherever it went, beautiful places. We're going to roster ourselves on those ones. It was absolutely brilliant, So going back now right to the beginning with some of the youngsters who listen, and I say youngsters, anybody who's younger than me, which is kind of the whole nation. Air traffic control in those days, there were hardly any aircraft to control. We used to sit at Durban Airport. Okay, we had 3 positions there. There was tower on 1187, approach on 1191, and information on 1205. There was an airway between Johannesburg and Durban called White 99. They were all colors in those days. Okay. White 99. And then there was an advisory route from Ladysmith, I think, to Vrede, where it wasn't controlled. So information looked after the advisory airspace, approach looked after the controlled airspace, and tower looked after the ATZ. And then to keep us in a job, SAA organized that SA 501 departed from Johannesburg at exactly the same time as SA 500 departed from Durban in the morning, 7 o'clock. So the 2 met halfway, which we had to now separate. The only 2 aircraft that were flying in controlled airspace, we had to separate them. And they were the old fluffy L737s or 727s on some of them, but the old 737s, the basics, they were only flight level 260, 270, 290 on a good day. That was it. So they'd all come down to Durban level 270 and go back up to Joburg at level 280. So it wasn't a hell of a lot of work to do, but we had no radar. There was no radar, no surveillance radar in those days. All we had was a PPI radar, planned position indicator radar, which just sort of looked at the little circle around Durban Airport. And you could give aircraft approaches, talk down approaches on that radar. It didn't have a glide slope. You only had kind of like a localizer. So you could keep the aircraft on the center line and basically give him like a CDFA approach, okay, and tell him, you're now 5 miles, your altitude should be 1,500 feet, and turn right 1 degree or whatever, and you're now 4 miles, altitude should be 1,200 feet. And I can't exactly remember what the decision altitude was. It wasn't decision altitude. It would have been MDA or a DDA. Must have been about 400 foot, which was pretty brave of those guys to put their faith in us. I never got round. I never got qualified on that because that was in my real junior years. Nobody would ever let me loose on that. But Jimmy Lang he was the absolute expert on that. And one day, I remember clearly a Vampire, we got a flight plan from Longabon, where a major down in the Air Force at Longabon, his father had fallen seriously ill, and he was in St. Augustine's Hospital in Durban. And the Air Force had said this major could take a Vamp to Durban, which is kind of limit of its range. And off he went with drop tanks, I would imagine, would have to have been with drop tanks. And he didn't check the weather very well, and we had some really clampus weather in Durban on that day. And this guy called up for descent, and we used to, he had ADF on the aircraft, obviously, and we could pick him up on a VDF needle that we had, which basically every time the aircraft called, it pointed to his QDM to bring him to the station. So we could bring him to the station and then pick him up on the PPR radar, which we couldn't see him on the radar. The bloody Vamp's made of wood. Well, the body is, the fuselage is. So, Jimmy Lang was trying to pick this guy up on radar, and every now and again he got a little blip on the guy, and he tried to get him on the final approach, and then he lost him, and the Vamp did a go-round, and he came back, and fortunately the second time between Jimmy and the pilot, they managed to make it in, and he ran out of fuel taxiing in, and that's how much fuel he had left. So, things were a bit hairy in those days. We had many aircraft that got into trouble over Greytown, VFR aircraft flying down to Durban. They all had a pattern, those aircraft. All the ones that got into trouble were people coming down to Durban for dirty weekends. It was absolutely amazing, okay? The one where the family was on board, the father would say, look here, guys, this is too bad, we're going home. The one that had a girlfriend next to him said, there's no ways I'm missing out on this, and he would push on regardless. And there was that real sad story up, put it on Fly Africa recently, of that young boy. Friday morning, we got a flight plan, came through, made out a little flight progress strip for it, gave it to Peter Morgan, who was the approach control on the day. Peter looked at this, was from Wonderboom to Virginia in a Cessna 182. Peter said, this guy will never make it. He put the progress strip on the board, but forgot about it. Nothing was going to happen. And anyway, nothing did happen. Tuesday morning, we were on duty, Peter and I together, got a call from the Seven Oaks police station commander. And the guy said he's got a little boy that's walked into the police station. He says he was involved in an aircraft crash a couple of days ago. And what had happened, this aircraft had crashed at Greytown. His uncle flying it, who was, I would imagine, his mother's new boyfriend, himself and his brother. His mother was severely injured. The other two were killed. The little boy survived. He took his mother, made her comfortable near a river, went and got her some water. Eventually she died. Some local workers came along and he heard their voices and he went to them and they took him to the police station.
Sure.
And that was a big story. It was in Scope magazine and all over. And just recently, there was an article about that little boy. He's obviously a big man these days, and he was retelling his story. And that's why I put that story on Fly Africa. John Whitaker was a controller there one day, and he was talking to a guy who had ended up IMC near Greytown. I think he was in a Cherokee. And John and I were both flying then. We'd both done our PPLs and probably a little bit of instrument flying. And this guy was flying along. You could see the little blip going along, and suddenly the blip was standing still. And John called him and asked him, ops normal, And this guy, all you could hear was the wind noise, and he was obviously in a spiral dive. And John spoke him out of it. Yeah, and the guy ended up getting to Virginia, never even phoned and said thanks. Yeah, pretty amazing. But every now and again we used to have a clash of traffic where we had SA flight. It was always a 601 coming in from the Cape, from East London or PE. And then we had the Joburg flight coming in. So now we had 2 aircraft we had to separate, And this is obviously bar all the general flying area. There were a general flying aircraft. There were dozens of them flying around at the time. And Rob Perkis, I know Rob will be listening to this, and he'll remember this story. Oh, Rob was a cheeky bugger, and he said something really funny. He had a Herc, I think a Sapphire Herc or military Herc, I can't remember, on direct approach for runway 05 in Durban. No, he had him on base leg. And he had a 737, SA 737 on a direct approach. And he'd put the Herc number 1. And the 737, there were no speed restrictions in those days. Nothing. Until the bird went right through that 737's bulkhead. Terry Jones was the captain out of Bloemfontein. He hit a bird at 300 knots, and it came right through the radome, right through the bulkhead, took the whole instrument panel out, went right down the aisle. And then they said, no, below level 100, 250 knots max. Anyway, the 737 coming in from the Cape was going like hell. The pilot was obviously in a hurry. So Rob said to him, reduce speed to 250 knots. So a bit of a grumble, but the guy reduced speed to 250 knots, but he was still catching the Herc. So Rob said, reduce further to 210 knots. So the guy, more of a grumble, reduced to 210 knots. Rob said, reduce further to 180 knots. So the pilot said to Rob, the captain said to Rob, do you know what speed this thing stalls at? So Rob said, negative, but if you ask your first officer, I'm sure he'll know. That was the last year. He complied with the speeds thereafter, But, it was great days. A hell of a good start into aviation, going via air traffic control, because we did navigation, we did radio aids, we did MET. And when you come to write your comm exams, you've done all the subjects, man. You've got them all, So it was a really good thing. Now, there's one thing I can say. At my age now, I was born in 1952, so you can figure out my age now. If I had my life over again, I would do exactly the same as what I've done. And I don't think many people in this world can actually say that. It's been an absolute wonderful life. The people that I've met, the people that worked with me, I'd never say they worked for me, they worked with me. In Executive Aerospace, all the wonderful places we've been to. It's been absolutely fantastic, and it's a big thanks to the mentors in my life, including Vern McWilliams. Thanks for the job, which was a shitty job. And no thanks for all the hangovers you gave me. But we're going to miss you, Vern. And that's basically it.
Yeah.
I haven't got much more I can tell you.
I just want to go back to, you obviously mentioned the cadets at Executive Aerospace. And, you were obviously a pioneer there with the cadets. Cadets are such a big thing now. In fact, airlines probably wouldn't survive today without cadets. There'll be no one to fly the aircraft. Just go over some of those names, because there's some big names there. Of obviously, for me, Mark Finch comes to mind, and Mark Rabeck, and later, obviously, Barry Gove. But there's been some wonderful young, sort of my age guys as well. Tommy, it's Safir, and so a lot of these characters along the way who are now some of those younger guys I mentioned, or in your later part of the cadet scheme. They all sort of big shots in the airlines today.
They are.
So just go back to, was it Mike and both
Mark Rabeck wasn't a cadet. He joined us joined me when I had the flying school, and he had already been flying charter up here in Johannesburg. He had an instructor's rating, and we took him on there. So he and I were the first two pilots in Executive Aerospace. Mike Finch had got his comm license a month or two prior to us starting, or 3 months prior to us starting exec. So he took Mike on. But they went straight into flying whatever we had, Barons, and we were doing freight runs in the Chieftains, and later in some King Airs. The next guy we took on after them was Dieter Phillip. Dieter ended up a captain with Singapore Airlines after he went to Swazi Air Cargo flying a 707. Then he went to Gulf Air, and then he ended up at Singapore Airlines. Really great guy, a fantastic guy. German accuracy. He was a German guy, a rare German South African. Only experience he had was dropping parachutists at Pietermaritzburg out of a Cessna 182 when we took him on. If I remember correctly, he had a ship's captain's license, I think through SAF Marine. He'll probably end up listening to this. He can get hold of me and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he was a ship's captain as well, which was quite amazing. Then we had Glenn Bennett. Glenn ended up with SAA. We had Peter Backen that flew with you guys at SA Express. We had Anthony McHale. He went to SAA, and I think he's now with Emirates. Moving on from there, I got to think of a lot of names. That was all when we were still down in Durban.
I know Andy Pennicott was with you for a bit.
Andy Pennicott did a contract for us up in Mozambique on the Skyvans during the Mozambique independence, the voting period that they had there, which we had two Skyvans operating up there. And then when we came up to Joburg, we really, when we started operating up here, particularly when we had the HS748s, going back to Durban, where we nurtured a lot of the young pilots. We had this freight run between Durban and Johannesburg on the Skyvans, and we were operating them with two crew. And that's where we had a guy, Peter Eriksson. He was Peter Eriksson. He ended up with Air Mauritius. I think it was Peter. I'm not sure what his first name. Mark Eriksson. Barry Gove joined us there. We had Kelvin MacDonald. He went to SA, but I believe he's now in Australia. We had Perry Challoner. Perry was a funny guy. His father was a lord. So he was the Honourable Perry Challoner as a first officer. Now, Perry is probably going to be listening to this too. Perry married a South African girl. He was actually he was a lawyer, I think, before he got his pilot's license. Hell of a nice guy. And he's now farming down in the Cape. If you go into any spa, you'll see his products, Challoners. So they make olive Tapignon, all these different little things. Yeah, that's all Perry. That's what he ended up doing. Who else flew the freight run? We had Dean Smith flying out of there. Obviously, Dean wasn't a cadet, but that was the first time Dean worked for me. He ended up working for me 4 times, I think. Dean and John Fraser were in King Air 90, Lima Zulu Romeo. and they landed at Mola Mola and hit a water buck and did some serious damage to the water buck and the aircraft. So
Dean was also the Father Christmas at your
yes,
Christmas
that's
parties.
right.
I've got a picture. I've got
He
a
was
picture.
the clown.
The
He
clown.
was the clown. Yeah,
I got a picture sitting on Dean's lap.
Yeah, that was funny. Then we moved up to Joburg and we had the HS 748s. It was much easier to run the cadet scheme because we brought the guys in on a 2-year contract. The first 6 months, we'd give them sort of menial type of jobs, driving the combis around, loading the catering, all that. And the idea was to see whether they were worthwhile, see what their attitude was, and see if they were worthwhile spending money on. If they got through that first 6 months, then we'd put them on the technical course for the 748. There were no simulators ever made for a 748. And then we would take them flying with us on any sector or any charter that we had a dead sector. So myself or Pete Evanstone, the 2 instructors, we would fly that with the guy in the jump seat, drop off the passengers, and then put the guy in the right seat and fly home. And that's how he did his rating, bar the circuits and landings and whatever. Our ratings on the 748, my rating, and Pete Evanstone, Barry, and we have to mention Tony Buston, of course. Tony was an absolute wonderful character in our company. Still in contact with him.
And besides yourself, if I could just jump in there, Tony probably had the biggest influence on my aviation career besides yourself, because I did a lot of flying with Tony, and he was an absolutely immaculate pilot.
Tony was the most natural pilot you've ever come across. He was the scruffiest guy in the cockpit, Tony, and when you hear this, don't get cross with me, but Tony had maps and pieces of paper floating around that cockpit. It looked like an explosion in Monty Paper Mill, I tell you. But nevertheless, he could fly an aircraft as landings, no matter what. It was a Cessna 206 or a bloody DC-9. He could really grease that thing on. He was really, really great guy, Tony.
Can I jump in with a story of my own there? We were flying, it was Bamako to... we used to fly Bamako to Sao Tome on the way back.
Yeah.
And we had just night stopped, and you had just organized it was the Nokia, I think the 6210.
E63.
E63 phones for the management there. And Tony was obviously one of the main guys at Exec, and I was flying with Tony as a new FO. And as my dad said, he was such a meticulous pilot, but not the neatest in the flight deck. And it had been pouring with rain in Bamako the night before. And the DC-9 had this quite a big sort of cup holder, and all aircraft do. But it was a good place to put your phone. So Tony put this brand new phone there, and we take off. And obviously on the DC-9, the thing used to climb like hell, 15 degrees nose up type of aircraft. And by the time we got to cruise altitude, Tony has a look, and this cup holder is now full of water, because the water used to run down and then collect into this cup. Now Tony, this is this brand new phone, and he's upset. He's one of these guys, he gets really upset. So this brand new phone, Tony totally pulls this thing apart. The whole thing is sitting on top of the glare shield, drying out quite nicely. And he's got this whole thing pulled apart, and he's got it dried up, puts it all together, and it's now working. And he's so flipping chuffed there. Cleans out the cup holder's now dry, puts it back in the cup holder. We start the descent into Sao Tome, the fucking thing fills up with water again. And on the same day, was it Sao Tome to Walvis?
Yeah.
Sao Tome to Walvis. Windhoek, sorry. And on that leg, we had lasagna as our in-flight meal. And Tony got himself ready for this lasagna. But between Tony trying to put it on his lap and get it into his mouth. This lasagna totally flipped over, and he had a shirt covered. Reminded me something of you that you would do, actually.
Yeah, no, that's happened to me
So
before.
Tony had a bust, brand new Nokia, and a lasagna shirt.
Yeah.
But that's a story that comes to mind. But a shout out to Tony.
Yeah.
A big influence on my aviation
what a
career.
fantastic guy. I was lucky enough to see Tony a year or so ago down in Cape Town. Both he and I ended up there together, and I was having breakfast at Jared's, and he was staying in the hotel right above.
Yeah.
So when I called him, he said, "Where are you?" And I said, "I'm at Jared's." He said, "I'll be down now." What are you talking about?
Yeah.
No, I'm staying in the hotel
That's
right above. So that was fantastic. Yeah, talking about Tony doing that. Tony and I flew to Chicago to go and pick up King Air and ferry it out. And we went with Alitalia on a DC-10. So we were sitting on the apron here, and Alitalia were very relaxed in those days. We were sitting in business class, and Jesus, service was fantastic. So that while we were waiting for start, the hostie asked us what would we like to drink. So Tony says he'd like some wine. So we get a bottle of red wine. So Tony had the pair of very nice longs on, like chino type things, sort of grey or creamy color, and a bottle of red wine, which he ended up spilling on his lap. Okay, so he had this big red patch right in his vital area. It looked like he had just survived a circumcision. And we had to go through Rome, and then change flights in Rome to get to Chicago. So, Tony's been a great friend and absolute wonderful guy.
great question. Speaking about Tony's, did Tony Clegg fly for you?
Yeah,
as well?
Tony Clegg flew for us. Yeah, Tony and his son Roy.
Yeah.
I see Roy occasionally when I've been across at Commie. Yeah, Tony was a phenomenal guy, a really, really lovely guy.
Got a funny story about Tony Clegg as well. Just quick one. But I was working in ops for Nale a good couple of years back as well when they operated G1s, and Tony was freelancing for them as well. And I remember being in the cockpit, giving them some paperwork before they dispatched, and Tony had jumped into the flight deck. First officer was busy working there. Tony takes a seat on the captain's side, and the next minute he shoots up, and he's like, Jesus Christ. We were like, fuck, Tony, are you okay? And he said, yeah, no, I'm fine. Just sat on my testicle. Never forget that day. Sorry, I just figured I was just speaking of Tony's. And
Tony was a lovely character. He flew beautifully. You're going back to the cadets that we had up here. There was Tommy Rotenbach. There was Chris Simmons. Lovely story with Chris Simmons. We had a short list of 5 guys we were taking on. We were down in Durban. Pete Aviation, Tony Buston, a couple of the others were doing the interviews. I wasn't involved. And afterwards I said, who have you chosen out of the 5? So Peter said him and him, so all right, well, Chris wasn't one of them. So anyway, the next day, Chris arrives at work. So I said to Peter, you told me Chris didn't get the job. So he said, no, he didn't. So I said, well, he's at work today. So Peter, you remember how Peter Aviation was, Peter, not my fucking problem. So I went to Chris. I said, look, unfortunately, Chris, you weren't successful with the job. So Chris said, yeah, I don't mind, but I'm not going home. So fine. Every day Chris came to work. And after about 3 weeks, I said, Peter, this is getting embarrassing, Please employ this guy. He's got something good in his attitude, which we did. And Chris was an absolute pleasure to have in the company. He worked hard. He was bloody fantastic. So it came to the end of the 2 years, and it was time for Chris to go, because that's when the contract ended. A couple of months before it went, and Chris came to me and said, oh, Keith, can't you extend my contract? I've got CVs out everywhere, and I haven't had any good replies. So I said, no, you can't, because you'll hold up the whole little sausage machine behind that, you're going to cause a blockage in it, So anyway, late November, early December, I think Chris got an invite to Cathay for an interview. So he asked me for some time off. So he went across. And when he came back, he said, I'm not so sure if I'm going to get called back for the second one, whatever. And if I remember correctly, it was around the 16th, the holiday. We were down in Cape Town on holiday. And Chris said, I've been called back for the second interview. So he went back and he called me, I think it was actually on the 16th, and said, Keith, I'm in.
Sure.
Okay. And Chris joined there as a junior first officer. He ended up moving through the ranks. He ended up, I would imagine, a senior first officer. He got a posting in Switzerland. I think he ended up marrying a Swiss girl. And they got a posting in Amsterdam. So they were living in Switzerland and commuting to Amsterdam. Then eventually got his command, so he had to go back. And there Chris was. If Chris didn't have that attitude of, I'm getting this bloody job, come out of our water, he wouldn't have ended up there, Yeah. And this is what we looked for. The other people, there was Kerry Forrester. She ended up in SA. Scully's daughter, Sally. There was Charlotte Lovell Green. Just recently, a guy here, ex-SA guy that I think was flying for Seme in the time, he said to me, you know my wife. So I said, do I? So he said, yeah, Charlotte. She was Lovell Green. I said, yeah. I said, how's she? No, we married, we got kids. Oh, she's a lovely girl. And so he said, I said, oh, I'd love to chat to her. He said, I'll give you her number, So I looked at my phone and said, you don't have to. I've already got your wife's because I never delete numbers. And obviously she hadn't changed her number, So as I say, these people all keep in touch, They're all grateful. There was Rob Waghorn, who is still around. You see him all over Facebook. He's flown for just about everybody around the world. He was a really wonderful character for us as well. Other ones up here, Lance Milam was one. I don't know where Lance ended up. And there were 69 of them. I can't relate to all of them. I could if I really put my mind to it. But for those of you who haven't named, I'm sorry.
No, you've been pretty good with the names. Obviously, flying today is a little bit different. It's, I suppose, viewed differently from people on the inside that's in the industry. I get the impression that a lot of people flying today are looking more for a job rather than saying
the passion
behind it. And, flying could be a job. And I think other industries are like that. I don't think any little kid grows up and says, I'm going to be a fucking lawyer, It's a bit of a shitty thing to do, but you get into it because it's a good job.
Yeah.
And flying is sort of, it doesn't work all the time if you look at it that way. But in saying that, there's a lot more challenges today with the industry.
Mm.
You mentioned some of the people that helped you get you through. One of the things there that is significant that you didn't mention in the flight plan cadet scheme at Exec, there was no bond. There was no training bond. That training bond is, can be a killer as well. And there's, that's going on today. So, what are the challenges in that today that, that exist today that didn't exist then? And how do these youngsters overcome it? And should you be getting involved in aviation if you don't have that underlying passion, I guess is my question.
Well, with us here at Samara, I mean, the attitude is just everything, We obviously rate people on knowledge, skills, and attitude, and we can help them with the knowledge. They should have some of it. We can add the knowledge to it. The skills, we try and teach them in the simulator. But the attitude, if they, young people with a cuck attitude grow up to be old people with a cuck attitude, unfortunately. So you can't really change that. These youngsters that we train here, mainly on the 145, mainly from Nigeria, as you know, a very varied bunch of people. Some of them come here because they have wealthy parents who can easily afford to send them for their rating. By the way, a lot of these guys learned to fly in Nigeria during the oil heydays when the oil price was high and things were really booming in Nigeria. But then the oil price crashed and promised jobs never happened. So some of them are coming here having obtained their commercial license 9 years prior. And they hadn't done any flying in the meantime. They renew their license, come here, and then hope to be able to fly a high-flying, glass-cockpited, swift-wing jet,
It's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen that easily, but those are the guys that we are training. And, Bryan and Ryan both will know that some of them are absolutely brilliant. Guys like David Osadebi. I mean, David and Nanjul, two of the pilots that I've trained that to me were still probably two of the best students I've ever had. But the amount of effort that they went into, and the effort that they put into it. Then you get the other guys that come along here not really interested. But if they pass, and hats off to some of them, they come back 6 months later for their recurrency, come back another 6 months later, and, now they're really keen, and the captains like flying with them, and they're good pilots, and they come back for their command ratings 6 years later, and it's really nice. We're kind of doing a very similar thing to what we were doing with the cadet scheme here, and which is why my current job, it's such a privilege to have. Driving to work in the morning at 4 o'clock, I just feel I'm so bloody lucky to have this job and to be able to train these young guys and see them through their career, just like we were doing with the cadets, and just like people like Alf Hendy and Vern that helped me, did it. So it's a big wheel. It's turning all the time, and Simero itself here, the ERJ 145 is obviously the prime aircraft for these brand new 200-hour pilots. We all had to go and fly little Cherokees and eventually a Bonanza, which was kind of really big for our first job. These guys are getting into the 145 as their first job, and Nigeria aviation is absolutely booming. Of course, we don't only do people from Nigeria, but it is our biggest market on the ERJ. So we have this pleasure of actually seeing these guys go through. And I try and give my phone number to every one of the guys that come here. My phone book and my phone number's got my phone, the contacts on my phone. There are thousands of them. And these guys, I tell them they can phone me any time of the day or night if they've got any problems. If they have a problem with the captain, if they have a problem with they don't understand an SOP or a technical thing, they call me, and they do call me. On a weekend, I get 6 to 12 calls every weekend. I'm happy to talk to the guys. They're all my friends. I've got more friends in Nigeria than I have in the rest of the day.
Well, I think obviously you've played a big mentorship role with a lot of them, and something I say, I was lucky. I grew up. I had you. So if I saw a plane flying, what is that? And you would tell me, why does it do that? You would tell me. So I had someone all the time giving this information, and a lot of these students that we train from all over Africa, they're first generation pilots in their family, and that's why the role that certainly you play with them is such an important role, because I think there's not a successful businessman. You've listened to a lot of these podcasts, read biographies, all of them will mention at least one, normally 2 or 3 mentors that help them get from there to there. Joe Rogan does it every single podcast. This guy helps him with it. So you need mentors, and maybe that is the thing that I asked the question, what's different today? And maybe there's probably less mentor type characters because everyone's on their own sort of vibe, doing their own thing. But playing a leadership role, a mentorship role for young pilots is probably a very important thing. And we have them through our career. You said something to me at the beginning of my career. Said you're going to fly with guys that are excellent at speaking to the passengers. You're going to fly with guys that have excellent hands. You're going to, fly with guys that are, great in an emergency. And I never really understood that until I'd got a few hours behind my belt, and you realize Paul Sears, one of the name. Paul was such a relaxed character. You think, geez, if something happens, I'm going to have to take the ship here. But one day I remember flying with him into Port Elizabeth, and I think it was like a 35-knot crosswind, and Paul, like, he came into his own there. It was like, thank God I've got something to do. And you fly with, you take little bits from all these different role models that basically, shape you into the pilot that you become later in life. And that's a critical thing, a critical role that you've played. And I know a lot of these youngsters that we train really, really value the input that you give them there.
Yeah. They don't get any guidance. They're flying their schooling. Funny enough, the ones who learn to fly in Nigeria usually are of a better quality than the ones that went to fly in America. It's quite clear that the American flying schools, when they see African pilots come across, they see money. They have boxes to tick. They tick the boxes. The guy leaves with a license. The quality of I'm not saying all of them, but I'm saying generally, the quality of pilots that have been trained in America is below the standard of the quality of the pilots coming from Nigeria. The worst, of course, we see, and I don't want to speak negatively anywhere, the worst, of course, the ones that have learned to fly in India. My goodness, when they come here, I want to run a mile.
Very difficult.
Very, very, very poor standard of training, basic training, and very difficult. I mean, the one guy came here, comm license, he had no idea that an ADR or the basic artificial horizon showed you roll and pitch.
Yeah.
He had no idea that it showed you pitch. He had a comm license.
And that's something that's inherently difficult to train out of them. If the
Yeah.
foundation is broken or not laid properly in the beginning, it's
That's right,
very
yeah.
difficult to
That's
try and
right.
rectify later on.
Yeah, that's right. But it's really a very rewarding job that we have here. And as I said, I'm very, very lucky. Our company's owned by a French group. All the directors are French. Our CEO in our company, Nicolas, he is probably one of the most astute businessmen I've ever come across in my life. Have the utmost respect for him and all the other directors. And the really nice part about it is they leave us alone. Every now and again, there's a sort of, they don't understand why we're doing something, but then we discuss it out. But they let us run this company with very, very, very little interference. It's all become more corporate lately and of late. So they want certain systems in place, but they don't interfere with the operation at all. So we're really lucky. We're our own bosses here. I always tell Nicola, look, I run this like my own company. I haven't ever worked for anybody really, since 1976 or 78 or something. So I just treat this as, my own company, and I'm really lucky.
Obviously, something that comes to mind, and I've known this, but listening to you speak now is more evident as well. You took quite a difficult path. It wasn't the normal path. I suppose going to SAA would have been, route number one, which a lot of people took and had wonderful careers there. You took a different path, and you said, you wouldn't change your life again. But, one of the things that I obviously know, aviation to you, it's always been, it's been your life. And aviation safety, flying properly, being prepared, just treating aviation as the most professional industry in the world, you've done your whole life. And that's kind of led you on this path and led you to where you are today. And like you say, a lot of parallels what you're doing today to what you did at the beginning of Exec. And I really respect that, because obviously it's something that has been handed down to me. And we both take this extremely seriously. And one of the things one of our instructors said to us is at the beginning of our CRJ type rating, he said, this isn't for everyone. It just isn't. You have to have that in you.
Mm.
And so thank you for passing that important part of aviation down.
One of the first things I said when there was Mike Rabeck, Mark Finch, and myself in the early days, 1984, I said, let's create an environment in which pilots can operate safely, where there's no pressures put on them financially, accountants trying to run the business, which so often happens. Let's just create an environment, make everything available, whether it's your little ops office, flight planning, any equipment they need. Let's just do it. Okay. Do it properly from the beginning. And that attracted a lot of good pilots. I mean, Peter Ovenstone had, I don't know how many jobs in his life. Peter ended up coming to us. He worked for us longer than he worked for anybody else in his life. He actually passed away while he was still working for us, and so we attracted guys. We had Tony for all those years, and one other guy that I must mention, a lot of people would know him, was Tony Wicksteed. Tony Wicksteed was very influential in my life. Whenever he did a charter anywhere in the Barren or something like that, hey, Keith, come and fly with me, and I'd go and fly with him. So before I started my PPL, I had about 60 hours of bombing around the country with Tony. And that really helped, little things like that. So he was another real mentor in my life. At my age now, I would like to carry on with what I'm doing. I have absolutely no intention of retiring. Our directors, if they listen to this, they're probably saying, oh, my God, we've got to put up with him for longer. But, there's so much more to put back into flying. It's been so good to me. If I can just help, and all the information I've gathered, and I say to these students, we're not geniuses as instructors. We are just a memory bank. And every little good thing we've seen that a good pilot does, we have been able to use that to pass on to another pilot. So my memory bank, my data bank at this stage of my life is pretty full. So if I've got to dig deep, we got a student that we're really having difficulty with trying to understand something, I can go way back 30, 40 years and say, I've seen this once before. I remember hearing a captain explaining to a first officer in this way, and that's what we do. So we really just a data bank, okay? And I've got another 10 years. Hopefully, Vern McWilliams passed away at 93 years old. I hope I'm still around at 93 years old. I don't know if I'll still be working then, but I'd really like to work for another 10, 15 years. And long as I can ride my bike, long as I can play with my old cars that I restore along the way, and I live a very, very happy life with the most wonderful girl. She puts up with all my shit along the way, but she's so loving and so supportive, and so thanks to Lucci for being there with me.
No, that's great. I don't think we could have planned a better 200.
No, look, I think, it's been the best way to mark
celebrate
this milestone. And, I'll quickly jump in and just say it's been really, really interesting to listen to your story full circle, Keith. I mean, obviously we all work closely together, and I pick up tidbits as we go along, but to sit down in a conversation setting like this and to listen to everything from the beginning to where you are now, it's really been tremendous. And, thank you for your contribution to aviation and to what you teach us all along the way. I mean, we all learn from you, and I I really hope there's going to be more of these types of conversations going forward.
Yeah, well, thank you for the times you had to help me sort my computer out because I know absolutely bugger all about it.
Yeah. Well, book a spot for number 300 because we aren't stopping. But thanks to you, Paul.
Yeah,
because couldn't have done it without you.
It's been a joy.
And,
getting congratulations, guys. It's unbelievable that you've done 200 of these. Unbelievable.
It is. Yeah, we're pretty proud of it.
I had no idea somebody could talk shit for 200 episodes and entertain so many people.
we've kind of had that gift since the day we first met at SACS. Brian and I have never been shy of shit to talk about, especially if there's a couple of beers in the mix.
Yeah. And funny enough, over the last week and a half that the podcast has just grown. It's doubled in size in the last 14 days. So timing for this couldn't be better. We're not going to stop. And, we're already the world's premier aviation podcast. So we have to think of some new goals, but, we'll get there.
100%.
It's a big weekend of sport ahead. There's the Bokke playing, obviously, will no doubt be dominating Australia. And then the big one is Dricus du Plessis taking on Israel Adesanya in the UFC. Dricus is defending his title. And this is a big fight. So I always push the UFC, but if you want to get into it, believe you me, it's in Australia. It'll be probably somewhere between 5:30 and 7 in the morning on Sunday morning. And it's a big fight. It's going to be incredibly tough for Dricus. Israel is an absolute machine. So it's a one hell of a fight. Dricus, although he's the champion, he's probably going in as a major underdog on the betting. So, that's a real good one. This has been awesome. Fantastic way to celebrate number 200. Have a lovely weekend ahead, everyone. And we'll see you next week. Goodbye for now.
Yeah, cheers, everyone. And all those people out there that I've been in contact with throughout my career, just wish you luck and happy life, happy aviation life. And I hope to see you all again sometime.
Bye for now.